For 3,000 years, King Tut's tomb was a ghost story, buried under the Egyptian desert. When Howard Carter finally broke the seal, everyone was ready for a fairy tale of golden chariots and pharaonic splendor. But the truth was stranger, and a lot more human. What Carter found wasn't just treasure, it was a scene of panicked improvisation. The tomb was small, the burial rushed, and the famous golden mask, it might not have even been made for him. It tells a story not of a god-king, but of a boy whose sudden death threw an empire into chaos. This wasn't a perfect, serene send-off. It was a scramble, a desperate attempt to secure a legacy against the clock. The real treasure of Tutankhamun's tomb isn't the gold, but the whispered secrets of vulnerability and fear it held for millennia. We thought the horror in Tutankhamun's tomb would be loud, a dramatic curse, a scream from the past, something to justify our fear. But the real horror was quiet. So quiet, it took decades for anyone to notice. It waited patiently, hiding beneath layers of gold, resin, and the carefully crafted stories that made the discovery feel safe. And when it finally revealed itself, it wasn't a shock, it was an unsettling whisper. The truth is, this tomb was never meant to be entered this way. Not by the glare of electric lights, not by hurried hands, and certainly not by minds hungry for a spectacle. It was meant to stay sealed, not because it was dangerous, but because it was unfinished, improvised, fragile. It was a space built not for eternity, but for damage control. From the moment the first seal was broken, something felt wrong. Not cursed, just wrong. The air was stale, thick with centuries of suffocating stillness. Objects were stacked too closely. Furniture leaned against chariots, and statues blocked doorways, as if thrown there in a hurry. This wasn't the orderly precision ancient Egypt was famous for. This was panic disguised as ritual. Tutankhamun's tomb was small, shockingly small for a pharaoh. Even before its contents were catalogued, the size alone suggested something had gone terribly awry. Pharaohs were supposed to prepare for death their entire lives. Their tombs were grand monuments to eternity. This one felt temporary, almost borrowed, as if someone had whispered in the dark, "This will have to do." Inside, the sheer amount of gold was blinding, but gold can be a brilliant distraction. It reflects attention away from structure, away from logic, and away from true intention. And the intention here wasn't grandeur, it was containment. The first chamber told the story immediately. Sacred animal-shaped beds were stacked awkwardly. Boxes were sealed without any symmetry. Food offerings were packed in so tightly, far more than necessary. It was protection layered upon protection, not for a journey of abundance, but out of fear. A deep-seated fear that something had gone wrong, and a desperate fear that it might follow them. Ancient Egyptians believed that disorder invited chaos, and that chaos threatened the very fabric of the universe. So what they created inside this tomb was an attempt to smother disorder with excess, to bury a terrible uncertainty beneath layers of ritual and meaning. At the center of it all was a boy. Tutankhamun was never supposed to matter. His reign was brief, his political significance minimal. His name was nearly erased by successors eager to forget his lineage. And yet, his tomb survived untouched for 3,000 years, not because of its importance, but because of neglect. Forgotten things are often preserved far better than celebrated ones. And what was preserved here wasn't a story of triumph, but one of profound vulnerability. As the team uncovered the burial chamber, the nested shrines filled the space so completely that moving became a challenge. For massive wooden structures, each covered in gold, pressed against the walls like enormous barriers, there was no room to walk freely, no margin for error. This wasn't elegant planning, this was compression. A body sealed away in layer after layer, as if distance itself were the only real protection. The famous coffin within a coffin within a coffin was not unusual for a pharaoh. What was unusual was how tightly everything fit. The margins were wrong. The proportions felt strained, forced. This tomb had clearly been adapted, not designed from scratch. And then, there was the body itself. Long before modern science could speak, the ancient embalmers had left their own clues. The amount of resin used during mummification was excessive, so much so that it hardened, blackened, and literally fused the body to its wrappings. This was not standard practice. Resin preserves, yes, but too much of it damages. It generates heat, it warps the flesh, and it locks limbs into unnatural positions. Why would experienced embalmers do this? The unsettling answer is, they were afraid. Afraid the body would not survive the journey to the afterlife intact. Tutankhamun's physical condition was never meant to be examined by the living. The tomb was designed to hide it, not to display it. The sheer number of amulets, the repetitive spells, the obsessive layering of protection, these weren't just honors, they were reinforcements. The horror here is subtle. It doesn't leap out at you. It accumulates, piece by piece. A broken ritual here, a reused object there, a rushed inscription, a tomb that's too small, a body sealed far too tightly. Slowly, the true picture forms, a king who died suddenly, whose body did not conform to their ideal, whose death created a crisis that no one had time to solve properly. And ancient Egypt did not tolerate problems in death. To die imperfectly was dangerous. It threatened the cosmic balance. It suggested disorder had broken into the divine chain. And Tutankhamun's death, so young, fragile, and inconvenient, was exactly that. So they buried the problem, literally. They didn't announce the weakness. They masked it with gold. They didn't correct their mistakes. They covered them with spells. They didn't slow down. They rushed. The quiet horror of the tomb is not that something evil was trapped inside. It's that something profoundly human was. A boy who didn't fit the divine role he was born into. A body that struggled to meet expectations in life and terrified those who had to prepare it for eternity. The tomb is not a monument to triumph over death. It's a frantic negotiation with it, and every single object inside whispers the same message. This was not supposed to happen this way. The silence of the tomb preserved that message perfectly. For 3,000 years, no one interrupted it. No one corrected the story. No one smoothed over the rough edges. When it was finally opened, the world looked at the glittering gold and completely missed the fear trembling just beneath its surface. The horror was never supernatural. It was organizational, psychological, and heartbreakingly human. And once you notice it, you can never unsee it. This tomb isn't frightening because of curses or death. It's frightening because it shows what happens when a civilization built on perfection is forced to confront its own fragility. And this was only the beginning of the secrets it held. We all know the story of Tutankhamun's tomb, a treasure trove of unimaginable wealth, a perfectly preserved window into ancient Egypt. But what if the gold, the jewels, and the famous mask are all hiding a darker, more urgent secret? A story not of divine kingship, but of a desperate cover-up. Let's peel back the layers of gold and uncover the truth. The first clue is the tomb itself. It's small, awkwardly shaped, and tucked away in the Valley of the Kings. The corridors take sharp, unexpected turns. The chambers feel cramped. This wasn't a grand royal mausoleum planned for decades. It was a rush job. It feels like an adaptation, a last-minute solution for a king who died far too young and far too suddenly. Once you stop being dazzled by the gold, you start to see it everywhere. Signs of reuse. Look closely at the inscriptions, and you'll find faint traces of earlier names, scraped away and overwritten with Tutankhamun's. Some of the funerary objects don't quite match his royal titles. Why? Because they weren't made for him. They were repurposed from someone else's burial. In a culture obsessed with perfection and custom-made afterlife arrangements for their pharaohs, this was highly unusual. It screams urgency. The giant golden shrines that encased the sarcophagus were so large they could unfit through the doorway of the burial chamber. They had to be assembled inside the room. This tiny detail is a bombshell. It means the chamber wasn't designed for them. The tomb was chosen, asterisk after asterisk. These massive objects were already made. Even the sarcophagus lid shows the pressure. It cracked while being lowered and had to be hastily repaired. A mistake like that would have been unthinkable for a pharaoh like Ramesses the Great. For Tutankhamun, it was simply hidden and accepted. This frantic pace is visible in the smallest details. Wooden chests were sealed in a hurry. Linens were folded without care. Food offerings were packed for volume, not elegance. It's as if the priests weren't trying to create a perfect eternal home, but were just trying to get everything inside, seal the door, and walk away. This wasn't about honoring the dead. It was about damage control. Why the rush? Tutankhamun's death plunged Egypt into a crisis. He was the boy king who restored the old gods after his father's chaotic religious revolution. His own lineage was controversial. With his sudden death, the fragile stability he represented was at risk. A smooth, fast transition of power was essential. Any delay, any question, could ignite chaos. So, the system did what systems always do under pressure. It prioritized function over form. Ritual became a checklist. And you can see this urgency on Tutankhamun's own body. The embalmers faced a disaster. Perhaps the body was damaged, or it was decomposing faster than expected. Their solution: resin, lots of it. Not carefully applied, but poured over the body. In the short term, it worked. The body was sealed, its shape preserved. But the chemical reaction from the resin literally cooked the king's body, burning his skin and fusing him to his linen wrappings. This wasn't the work of amateurs. It was emergency medicine performed by experts against a ticking clock. Even the iconic golden mask, a symbol of eternal perfection, tells this story of compromise. Evidence suggests it was originally made for someone else, possibly a female pharaoh, and was altered to fit Tutankhamun. The name was changed, the features slightly adjusted. The real horror of this tomb isn't a supernatural curse. It's the bureaucratic panic you can feel in every corner. Every reused object whispers of a deadline. Every mistake screams of pressure. The tomb's bare, undecorated walls are another giveaway. Compared to other royal tombs, they are silent. There are no grand tales of victory, no boasts of a glorious reign. The silence is deafening. It tells a story of a life cut short, a narrative that wasn't ready to be written. This tomb became a container, not just for a king's body, but for a nation's uncertainty. All the gold, all the treasure, wasn't just for the afterlife. It was camouflage. A dazzling spectacle designed to overwhelm the senses and distract from the uncomfortable truth that a young king died. The state was in turmoil, and those in charge were terrified of what might happen next. What was sealed away in this tomb wasn't a monster, but the quiet, golden evidence of fear. Eventually, all the attention is forced away from the mask, away from the gold, and toward the body beneath. And this is where the quiet horror becomes impossible to ignore, because bodies don't lie in the way objects do. They carry their history in damage, stress, and absence. Tutankhamun's body was never meant to be examined. It was meant to be sealed, protected, and forgotten into eternity. The embalmers worked to create an image of completeness, not a record of accuracy. And for centuries, that image held. When modern hands finally reached the mummy, the illusion began to shatter. The very first problem was just getting it out. The resin that had once been poured over the body as a protective layer had hardened into a black, tar-like shell. The king was literally fused to the bottom of his coffin. There was no gentle way to remove him. Limbs broke, joints separated. The damage that followed was blamed on all sorts of things: ancient violence, curses, even murder. But much of it actually occurred in the 20th century, during the recovery. This is important, because it reflects the exact same pattern we see in the burial itself. Urgency causing harm. But even before this modern damage, the body told its own story. The bones were thin. The legs were uneven. One foot was malformed, bent sharply inward, which would have forced an unstable, limping gait. This was not a mighty warrior king. This was a young man who struggled just to stand upright. The hundreds of canes found in his tomb weren't symbolic trophies. They were evidence of his daily reality. His spine showed clear signs of stress from his condition. His chest was narrow. His entire physique suggested frailty, not strength. And yet, the burial attempted to present the absolute opposite. Protective amulets were crowded onto the body, packed into every available space. Layers of gold covered up his weakness. Fine linen was wrapped to hide the asymmetry. In ancient Egypt, physical completeness was deeply tied to cosmic order. A damaged body threatened the deceased's entire journey into the afterlife. This belief is what shaped the horror that followed Tutankhamun's death. His body was a problem, and in their world, problems had to be solved, quietly. The embalmers attempted a correction. They filled gaps in the body with resin. They positioned his limbs in unnatural ways to suggest a symmetry that wasn't there. They added more and more layers, but it was a work of addition, not precision. They weren't trying to heal the body, they were just trying to stabilize its image for the gods. But perhaps the most unsettling detail of all is what is missing: the heart. Traditionally, the heart was the one organ always left inside the body. It was considered the seat of intelligence and emotion, essential for the final judgment in the afterlife. Tutankhamun's heart was absent. Whether it was removed intentionally or was somehow destroyed during the rushed embalming process remains unclear. But its absence was catastrophic in symbolic terms. To compensate, the priests added extra heart-shaped amulets. Spells were repeated. The layers of protection were doubled. This was not a routine burial. This was emergency theology. The chest cavity also showed signs of unusual treatment. The embalmers clearly struggled. Something about the internal condition of the body must have alarmed them. Maybe a rampant infection, a severe injury, or just unusually rapid decay. Whatever it was, they responded with excess. Again, not with elegance, but with sheer urgency. For decades, the skull became the central focus of speculation. Early X-rays suggested trauma. A fracture at the back of the head fueled dramatic theories of murder. But later, more sophisticated analysis complicated this narrative. The damage could have happened during the clumsy embalming, or even during modern handling when the head was removed. The truth, it seems, resisted a simple, dramatic story. What remained consistent through every new analysis was the evidence of weakness. Tutankhamun's body simply did not match the perfect, godlike image of kingship that ancient Egypt depended on, and so, that image was enforced upon him in death. The burial mask, so serene and perfectly symmetrical, is a lie of kindness. Perhaps it wasn't malicious, but it was profoundly protective. It shows what the king was supposed to be, not what he actually was. And this is where the quiet horror truly deepens. The tomb wasn't designed to celebrate a life. It was designed to hide a deviation from the ideal. The ancient Egyptians weren't cruel in this. They were being logical within their own worldview. Imperfection on Earth threatened the cosmic balance, and maintaining that balance ensured the survival of everything. The system responded accordingly, but systems don't have empathy. They just have procedures. Tutankhamun's body became an object to be corrected, contained, and stabilized. And yet, despite all of their efforts, the truth remained encoded in his very bones. When modern CT scans finally allowed scientists to examine the mummy without any physical disturbance, the picture became much clearer. He had a severe leg fracture, likely sustained shortly before he died, which may have become badly infected. When you combine that with evidence of genetic disorders from generations of inbreeding, and the fact he had contracted malaria, it created a fatal cascade. This wasn't a murder mystery, it was a story of biological failure. And biological failure terrified the ancient Egyptians more than any invading army or mythical curse ever could, because it couldn't be blamed on anyone, it couldn't be punished, you couldn't negotiate with it, it just happened. The tomb's response to this reality wasn't denial, but massive overcompensation. More protection, more layers, more gold. An almost desperate attempt to overwhelm the problem with ritual and wealth. The quiet horror is not that Tutankhamun died young. Many kings did. It is that his body exposed the limits of their most fundamental beliefs. The afterlife depended on wholeness, and his body was not whole. So they tried with all their might to make it appear so, and in doing so, they created a tomb that whispers panic rather than confidence. Every single amulet feels like an apology. Every thick layer of black resin is a delaying tactic. Every object reused from another pharaoh's burial is a compromise born from haste. The body wasn't prepared for eternity. It was rushed into it, and once that tomb was sealed, no one ever returned to correct the story. For 3,000 years, the tomb held that truth intact, not because it was hidden so well, but because for all that time, no one was listening for it. The real horror of Tutankhamun's tomb was never a curse waiting to strike down intruders. It was the silent, buried knowledge that even the most powerful civilization in the ancient world could not fix a broken body. And that terrifying knowledge was buried, layered, and sealed, just waiting. When we think of Tutankhamun's tomb, we imagine golden treasures and the whisper of a pharaoh's curse. But the true story, the quiet horror preserved within those sealed chambers, is something far more unsettling. It's not about a curse, it's about a system on the verge of collapse. Ancient Egyptian religion wasn't about faith, it was about maintenance. The Egyptians believed the universe needed constant human intervention to keep from falling into chaos. Their rituals weren't just symbolic gestures, they were essential tools. And when something went wrong, like the unexpected death of a young king, those tools were used to excess. Tutankhamun's tomb is saturated with this excess. Look at the amulets crowding his mummy, far more than necessary. You see spells repeated, protective symbols overlapping each other. This isn't a display of confidence, it's a sign of profound anxiety. When a system fears failure, it repeats itself. Each amulet had a specific job: protect the heart, guard the limbs, ensure the soul could breathe. But in this tomb, the same functions are covered again and again. Multiple amulets for the same purpose, multiple spells against the same threat. This suggests the priests doubted their own methods. They layered protections because they weren't sure which one would work. They were hedging their bets against failure, and they had good reason to worry. A critical piece was missing: the king's heart. For the ancient Egyptians, the heart was the seat of intelligence and emotion, essential for judgment in the afterlife. Its absence was an existential crisis. To compensate, the priests placed a stone scarab over the chest, inscribed with spells meant to act as a substitute heart. But could words truly replace flesh? This desperate act only highlights their anxiety. The chest cavity became a focal point of frantic ritual. Protection piled upon protection, a desperate insurance policy against cosmic disaster. The tomb's art tells a similar story. Unlike the grand elaborate decorations in other royal tombs, the walls of Tutankhamun's burial chamber are sparse and appear rushed. The figures are simple, the scenes minimal. This wasn't laziness, it was a race against time. The art here is purely functional, a kind of religious shorthand, just the essential scenes needed for the king's journey, with no embellishment. The priests weren't creating a masterpiece, they were trying to close a transaction with the gods, and they were terrified of it being rejected. This fear came from a place of deep instability. Tutankhamun's father, Akhenaten, had thrown the entire religious system into turmoil by abandoning the old gods. Even though Tutankhamun restored the traditional ways, the damage was done. The cosmic order felt fragile. Now, they were presenting the gods with an imperfect king, a body that didn't conform to the rules. The fear wasn't that Tutankhamun would be punished. The fear was that his imperfection could break the system entirely. So, the tomb became a fortress, a barricade against chaos. This is why we see an overwhelming number of guardian deities, not just one or two, but entire armies of them. Guardians guarding guardians. Its redundancy born from fear. The golden shrines enclosing the sarcophagus weren't just containers, they were filters, each layer designed to stop decay, corruption, and the forces of disorder. But security built on fear is never truly secure. Even the placement of objects feels defensive. Statues are positioned, not in celebration, but to confront intruders in the afterlife. It feels less like a welcome, and more like a containment facility. The king wasn't being released into eternity. He was being managed through it, his every step controlled. Because in life, control had been lost. This is the quiet horror of Tutankhamun's tomb. It's not a gateway to the afterlife. It's a lock on uncertainty, on imperfection, on a truth the priests couldn't fix. The religion wasn't offering comfort. It was desperately trying to compensate for a failure it couldn't admit. 3,000 years later, the gold still shines, the amulets still cling to the mummy, and the spells are still there, repeating themselves. But beneath all that splendor, what has truly been preserved is the crushing anxiety of a civilization terrified that their world was about to fall apart. We often think the mystery of Tutankhamun's tomb is about a curse or hidden treasure, but the real story, the one etched into the very haste of his burial, is far more chilling. It's a story of politics, power, and the cold, efficient machinery of a kingdom on the brink. To understand why a king was buried so quickly, you have to forget the gold for a moment and focus on the fear. Why the rush? Religion alone doesn't explain it. Egyptian beliefs were actually quite flexible, especially when power was secure. But at the time of Tutankhamun's death, power was anything but secure. The glittering rituals and golden masks were a facade, hiding a deep political crisis. Tutankhamun ruled at the end of a fragile, radical experiment. His father, Akhenaten, had turned Egypt upside down. He had shattered the religious structure, moved the capital, redirected the nation's wealth, and stripped power from the established priesthoods. He disrupted traditions that had kept Egypt stable for generations. When Tutankhamun took the throne as a boy, he officially restored the old gods and brought back the old ways. But this wasn't a triumphant return to glory. He didn't truly rule. He was a symbol of the restoration, a figurehead, and symbols are incredibly dangerous when they fail. So when this young king, the living symbol of stability, suddenly died, it sent shockwaves through the court. His death raised immediate, terrifying questions. Was the restoration failing? Had the gods turned their backs on Egypt? Who would rule next? In a culture where a king's health reflected divine favor, a frail dead boy suggested cosmic disaster. This perception had to be controlled, and fast. The burial became a critical piece of political theater. It needed to be smooth, unquestioned, and above all, complete. Any delay could be seen as weakness or uncertainty. Any deviation from tradition could invite speculation, and speculation could ignite a power struggle, destabilizing the entire transition of power. So, they accelerated everything. This explains one of the tomb's strangest features, the lack of detailed narrative scenes on the walls. Unlike other pharaohs' tombs, there was simply no time, perhaps, no desire to craft a story. Stories invite interpretation, and interpretation invites dissent. In a crisis, silence is much safer. The tomb wasn't built to glorify the king's short reign or explain his controversial death. Its purpose was purely functional, to precede. Power was being transferred, not remembered. The officials overseeing the burial weren't really concerned with what went into the tomb. They were terrified of what might happen after it was sealed. The burial was a performance, designed to reassure the living as much as to protect the dead king. Tutankhamun had to disappear cleanly and quietly. Any objects that might raise awkward questions about his family or his health were buried with him, not left out for discussion. The body was mummified and sealed away, beyond examination. The rituals were completed at record speed. The tomb was closed. And then, something truly remarkable happened. The king was forgotten. His successors made a deliberate effort to erase him. His name was left off of king lists. His monuments were neglected or claimed by others. His tomb, small and tucked away, was lost to memory. This wasn't an accident. It was a strategy. Tutankhamun belonged to a chaotic, embarrassing period that the new rulers wanted everyone to move past. Remembering him meant remembering instability. Forgetting him allowed a story of seamless continuity to be told. And the quiet horror is that this strategy worked perfectly. For over 3,000 years, Tutankhamun vanished from history. He wasn't cursed or violently erased. He was simply ignored. And ironically, this neglect is what preserved his tomb. Grave robbers, looking for the grand tombs of great pharaohs, walked right past his, because he wasn't considered great. This confirms a deeply unsettling truth. Tutankhamun mattered more as a political problem to be solved than as a person to be mourned. The speed of his burial reflects this cold reality. The political machine didn't pause to grieve a lost boy. It adjusted, it replaced, and it moved on. This isn't necessarily about cruelty. It's about structure. Political systems are designed to respond to death by minimizing disruption. The burial of Tutankhamun was an act of containment, not commemoration. This act of containment extended even to the tomb's location. It was placed in a side valley, not among the grand monuments of the Valley of the Kings. It was accessible, functional, and ultimately, forgettable. It wasn't a statement of power. It was an endpoint. The officials involved likely believed they were doing the responsible thing, ensuring stability, protecting tradition, and avoiding civil war. But sometimes, responsibility looks a lot like erasure. The king's youth, his probable illnesses, and his sudden death were inconvenient facts. The tomb concealed them. The silence that followed reinforced that concealment. The real horror here isn't a dramatic tale of betrayal or murder. It's the quiet, chilling horror of efficiency. Tutankhamun's humanity, his story, his struggles, his life was smoothed over for the sake of political order. His body became an object to be processed. His tomb became a tool to manage a crisis. This perspective finally explains the bizarre mix of things found inside the tomb. The overwhelming abundance of gold and treasure was there to project an image of legitimacy and divine wealth. It was a message of reassurance. But the narrative, the personal story, was absent because it complicated that message. What mattered wasn't meaning, but closure. The burial was designed to close a difficult chapter, quickly and permanently, allowing Egypt to move on. But that closure left behind evidence. Evidence of fear. Evidence of haste. Evidence of a system that prioritized its own survival over memory. The horror is that this system succeeded so completely that the king's story had to be rediscovered entirely by accident. 3 millennia later, the tomb was sealed, not to protect Tutankhamun for eternity, but to remove him from relevance in his own time. And yet, in a final, beautiful irony, by being forgotten, he endured. The gold remained. The fear remained. The political compromises remained, sealed in the dark. When Howard Carter finally opened that tomb in 1922, he didn't reveal a triumphant, godlike king. He revealed the raw mechanics of power under stress. A young body, processed with brutal speed. A burial designed to conclude, not celebrate. And a silence, engineered to last for eternity. This isn't the story of a curse. It's the story of how systems quietly dispose of what doesn't fit. And how, sometimes, what is disposed of waits patiently in the darkness, ready to be heard. For decades, the story of King Tutankhamun's death was a grand mystery. Was it murder, a chariot crash, a divine curse? The world clamored for drama, for a story fitting a golden pharaoh. But when science finally had its turn, when the clamor died down, the tomb began to speak again. This time, it wasn't in whispers of myth or sensational headlines. It spoke in data, quiet, careful, and unglamorous. For the first time, we weren't just interpreting Tutankhamun, we were starting to understand him. The era of speculation was ending, replaced by the quiet hum of a CT scanner. This incredible technology allowed us to peer inside the mummy, to see what lay beneath the wrappings without disturbing a single thread. The body could remain intact, its secrets revealed not by a chisel, but by light and software. Bone density, old fracture lines, even traces of soft tissue, it all became visible. A digital ghost of a boy king. The urgency of Howard Carter's discovery was gone. Now, there was only patience. And what emerged wasn't a single, dramatic clue to a murder mystery. It was a pattern, a lifelong story of fragility etched into his very bones. Tutankhamun was not the robust, warrior king depicted in some of his tomb's art. He was physically frail. His skeleton showed signs of chronic illness, a body under constant stress. His left foot was severely deformed, a condition known as clubfoot, bent inward so sharply that walking must have been a painful, difficult chore. The very bones in his legs showed stress patterns consistent with someone who couldn't move easily, who struggled with every step. His spine wasn't straight and strong. It showed abnormalities, a slight scoliosis curving his back. This wasn't a temporary injury from a fall or a battle. This was his reality from a very young age. This was a lifelong condition. Suddenly, the hundreds of walking sticks and canes found in his tomb made perfect, poignant sense. They weren't just ceremonial symbols of power. They were practical, necessary aids. Close examination of many of these canes revealed clear signs of wear and tear, the smooth patina of a hand that gripped them day in and day out for support. This was a king who literally leaned on support to get through his day. But why? What was the source of this profound weakness? DNA analysis deepened the picture, taking us from the individual to the dynasty. The story was written in his genes. Generations of close-kin marriage, of brothers marrying sisters and uncles marrying nieces to keep the royal bloodline pure, had a devastating consequence. It had weakened the entire line. Tutankhamun's DNA revealed a host of genetic disorders that compromised his bone development and crippled his immune system. His body was, from the moment of conception, predisposed to failure. This wasn't a curse from the gods, this was biology, and his weakened body was a perfect target for disease. When scientists analyzed his tissues, they found something else, the lingering traces of malaria parasites, and not just from one infection. It appeared he had suffered multiple, severe bouts of the disease. For a healthy person, malaria is serious. For a young man with a compromised immune system and chronic pain, it would have been life-threatening, a relentless assault on a body already fighting a losing battle. Then came the final blow, a severe fracture in his left leg, the same leg already burdened by his clubfoot. The break happened very close to the time of his death. We don't know for sure how it happened. Simple fall made catastrophic by his weak bones, a collapse during a malarial fever. The exact cause is less important than the timing. In a healthy teenager, a broken leg, while painful, would likely have healed. But in Tutankhamun, it was a catalyst. The open wound, the shock to his system. It was all his body couldn't handle. Infection likely set in, followed by a raging fever, and finally, a complete immune system collapse. There was no poison. There was no assassin hiding in the shadows. There was no mystical curse that felled him for disturbing a sacred space. The truth was far quieter, and in a way, far more tragic. It was just accumulation. A lifetime of genetic weakness, chronic pain, and recurring disease, topped by one final, unlucky accident. This truth, this quiet, medical reality, was deeply unsatisfying to a world hungry for drama, but it aligned perfectly with the strange atmosphere of the tomb itself. Think about it. The haste of the burial, the small, unfitting tomb, the gallons of black resin poured over the mummy as if in a desperate attempt to preserve or protect it, the over-the-top ritual. All of it spoke not of murder, but of panic. The embalmers knew the body was compromised. The priests and officials knew the situation was unstable. The hurried, almost frantic burial reflected that desperate awareness. Science didn't contradict the tomb. It confirmed the fear that hung in the air. The true horror of Tutankhamun's story isn't a violent, dramatic death. It's the creeping sense of inevitability. The feeling that the outcome was sealed long before that final fever. That his body had been fighting a war against itself from the very beginning. Tutankhamun didn't fail as a king. His body failed him, and the powerful, sophisticated system of belief and ritual around him panicked. This reframes everything we thought we knew. The rushed burial, the reused objects from other royal funerals, the excessive layers of protection. They weren't responses to a crime. They were responses to fragility. Ancient Egyptian culture prized order, marot, the concept of cosmic balance, symmetry, and eternal continuity. Tutankhamun's very existence was the opposite of that. His body was a symbol of the unpredictable, the weak, the temporary. And so the tomb became a desperate attempt to contain that reality, to build a golden, impenetrable buffer between the flawed human boy and the perfect, divine story Egypt told about its pharaohs. Modern science stripped away that buffer, and what remained was a young man, a teenager, born into a role of immense power and expectation that his own body could not sustain. The quiet horror of his story becomes empathy. It's the realization that behind that solid gold mask was not a remote, godlike figure, but a boy managing constant pain, debilitating illness, and the immense pressure of his position. Science didn't restore Tutankhamun's dignity by proving he was a perfect, strong warrior. It restored his dignity by giving us the honesty of his struggle. He wasn't cursed, he was just profoundly unlucky. And it's much harder to mythologize someone who was simply unlucky. The tomb preserved the fear of his time. Science preserved the truth of his life. And when you put them together, they tell a story that's far more complex and uncomfortable than any curse. It's a story about how even the most powerful societies, with all their gold, rituals, and myths, cannot protect their children from the simple, unyielding facts of biology. All of it, the golden shrines, the intricate spells, the layers of linen, they are reactions to human fragility, not solutions. And so, when science finally learned to listen quietly, the tomb stopped whispering about curses and conspiracies. It began to explain, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that has taken us a century to finally hear. When we think of King Tut, we see gold. A golden mask, golden chariots, golden everything. But what if the real treasure wasn't the gold at all? What if the tomb's true story is one of failure, fear, and a desperate attempt to hide a terrible secret? Once science peeled back the layers of legend, Tutankhamun's tomb revealed its true impact. It wasn't about the wealth. It was about understanding. The boy king was no longer a myth. He became a mirror, reflecting the fragility of power, the limits of human control, and the way history either remembers or forgets weakness. This discovery changed archaeology forever. Before Tut, excavations were often a mad dash for spectacle. The mummy itself suffered from this rush. Limbs were broken, and resin-coated tissues hardened and cracked. Early researchers, blinded by treasure, treated priceless artifacts like trophies. The tomb taught them a hard lesson. Haste can destroy the very history you hope to preserve. Museums and academics finally learned to slow down, using CT scans and DNA analysis not just for display, but for deep understanding. And the more they learned, the more the tomb whispered its original lesson. Perfection is an illusion. All the gold in Egypt couldn't hide fragility. All the rituals couldn't cheat biology. And no system, no matter how elaborate, can escape mortality. Our fascination with Tutankhamun reveals something deep about us, too. We're drawn to stories of failure disguised as success. The young king, once seen as an immortal god, now appears vulnerable, human. A ruler who couldn't walk without a cane, who suffered from illness and died before his reign truly began. That challenges our whole idea of absolute authority. Even the modern myths of curses and assassination plots can't hide the scientific reality. We now know his death was likely a tragic combination of genetic weakness, malaria, and an injury. The drama of murder is replaced by something much quieter and much more horrifying: inevitability. A system so obsessed with control couldn't prevent decay. This realization has reshaped how historians see Tutankhamun. He's less a symbol of dynastic glory and more a case study in human vulnerability. His body, the rituals, the tomb itself, they all reveal a deep-seated fear. The fear of disorder, of imperfection. The fear that one boy's death could unravel centuries of stability. Tutankhamun's tomb isn't a monument to triumph. It's a monument to anxiety, managed through secrecy and material excess. The tomb also teaches us about human behavior across time. The ancient embalmers, under immense pressure, responded with improvisation and overcompensation. You can see their haste in the artifacts. Modern archaeologists, under the glare of public scrutiny, sometimes repeated similar patterns of urgency and error. It shows that fear, whether of the gods or public opinion, shapes our decisions in ways that persist for millennia. But perhaps the most unsettling lesson is how the tomb preserved humanity itself. Behind every amulet is a response to imperfection. Every rushed object reflects an attempt to maintain control, and every artifact whispers the same message, that life, in all its fragility, continues to influence us long after death. The king may have died young, but his tomb survived because it was brutally honest about his weakness. In this sense, Tutankhamun's tomb is more relevant today than ever. It reminds us that no system can escape biological reality. It exposes the limits of wealth and authority. It shows that fear is universal, transcending time and culture. And it proves that history, while obsessed with triumph, often learns its most valuable lessons from imperfection. When you look past the golden mask, you see the truth. The canes, the fractured bones, the hurriedly placed shrines, they all tell the story of a fragile human boy, preserved inside a civilization obsessed with control. The tomb's quiet horror is its honesty. It's an unflinching record of weakness, panic, and human limitation, framed by the grandeur of a world that demanded perfection but could never achieve it. When Howard Carter peered into Tutankhamun's tomb, the world saw glittering gold. But beyond the spectacle, a quieter, more profound story began to unfold, one that would change our understanding of history, power, and ourselves. This wasn't just about a boy king. It was about the reflection his tomb cast back at humanity. The global fascination wasn't just for the treasure, it was for the vulnerability hidden beneath all that perfection. For the first time, the public met a king whose divine status couldn't mask his mortality. We saw a perfectly crafted gold mask, but we learned of the frail, broken body beneath it. This tension between godlike expectation and human reality is what made Tutankhamun's story echo across the globe. As exhibitions traveled from Cairo to London and New York, millions came face to face with this contradiction. They marveled at the golden chariots and intricate jewelry, but they also sensed the haste and improvisation in the burial. The tomb seemed to whisper a truth older than the pyramids. Wealth can't fix weakness, and grand rituals can't replace reality. This quiet unease became a powerful cultural lesson. Films and books portrayed the boy king as both an icon and a fragile human, while myths of curses added drama. Historians highlighted the scientific facts, his genetic conditions, his clubfoot, his likely cause of death from infection. Every new detail reinforced a humbling truth: mortality doesn't care about your throne. Tutankhamun's tomb became a case study not just in history, but in human fragility. This discovery even changed archaeology itself. Researchers learned that just preserving artifacts wasn't enough. The context was everything: the placement of objects, the evidence of a rushed burial, the condition of the linen. The mistakes made during the initial excavation in the 1920s became critical lessons for future generations, teaching a new standard of patience and precision. The tomb also reshaped our understanding of leadership. Tutankhamun's reign was short and historically minor, yet his burial revealed the deep anxieties of kingship. All the golden shrines, the layers of protection, the hundreds of amulets, they all pointed to a system terrified of disorder, a court desperately trying to manage the unmanageable. It showed that even the most powerful institutions panic when faced with weakness. This lesson extends far beyond ancient Egypt. It resonates with anyone who has felt the pressure of a system that demands perfection. The tomb records not just a king's burial, but a civilization's response to the fragility of one of its own. It's a mirror reflecting our own modern anxieties. The myths of curses are a perfect example. They are our own attempt to create a dramatic story to make sense of the unsettling quietness of death. Ironically, Tutankhamun had been almost completely erased from history by his successors, but being forgotten is what preserved him. When his tomb was rediscovered, it dominated the world's attention because it captured both magnificent wealth and undeniable human weakness. The very system that tried to erase him inadvertently ensured his story would be told more powerfully than any other. And so, the tomb teaches us a dual truth, one about ancient Egypt and one about all of us. It reveals the limits of our control and the subtle ways our systems react to vulnerability. Tutankhamun is a teacher from the past, speaking not in grand decrees, but in quiet whispers preserved in gold, resin, and hurriedly folded linen. His is a story of persistence, of a fragile life recorded with a mix of care, panic, and unintentional honesty. Today, the fascination continues because it's not just about history, When we look at Tutankhamun's treasures, we confront the same questions the ancient priests did. How do we deal with imperfection? How do we handle fragility in systems that demand stability? The tomb offers no easy answers, only evidence of panic, overcompensation, and ultimately, an enduring legacy. The true story of the tomb isn't a supernatural thriller, it's a human one. It shows how weakness and death ripple through our lives and societies, long after we are gone. It's a mirror, a cautionary tale, and an unsettling reminder that life is fragile. The final chamber of understanding, the last whisper from Tutankhamun's tomb, is its most unsettling lesson. Permanence is an illusion. His burial was meant to create eternity, a secure passage into the afterlife, a carefully managed reality that would outlast human memory. Yet, the tomb itself reveals a different truth. Systems, rituals, and even gold cannot preserve perfection, nor can they fully control outcomes. Every layer of the tomb tells a story of improvisation under pressure. The resin-soaked wrappings, the nested shrines, the hurriedly inscribed amulets, even the reused artifacts all point to a crisis. The tomb's planners faced a problem too big to resolve. A boy king, ill, fragile, and dying suddenly. This threatened cosmic balance and political stability. And time, the final constraint, would not wait. Their response was overcompensation. Layers upon layers, redundant amulets, repetitive spells, rushed inscriptions. Every object was meant to correct or contain something unseen, something that could disrupt eternity. And yet, despite all precautions, the tomb preserves the truth, not an illusion. It reveals not just a king, but a civilization wrestling with its own failures. The quiet horror is that this system of control was as fragile as the body it tried to protect. When modern archaeologists found the tomb, they mirrored that same ancient panic. Awed by golden legend, they rushed. They separated resin-fused limbs and cracked fragile bones, prioritizing spectacle over preservation. Curiosity repeated the ancient haste. The tomb exposed the limits of biology and the limits of human systems, ancient and modern alike. Urgency, it seems, can obscure understanding. Science eventually revealed the deeper reality. Tutankhamun's death was biological, not criminal. Genetic weakness, malaria, a severe injury, a convergence of chance and fragility. The boy king's body failed him, and the system around him responded with ritual, gold, and secrecy. The tomb's contents reflect this truth. Every hurried object, every reused artifact, every overlaid shrine is evidence of anxiety, improvisation, and human limitation. The quiet horror is not in curses or violence, it is in inevitability. This understanding transforms how we view history. Tutankhamun is no longer just a boy king frozen in time. He is a mirror reflecting the human condition, vulnerability in the face of expectation, mortality in the face of ambition. His tomb is a study in overcompensation, a cautionary tale that transcends centuries. It reminds us that power, wealth, and ritual cannot erase weakness. They can only attempt to obscure it. The tomb's silence is deliberate. There is no narrative celebrating conquest. It doesn't declare a life well lived. It documents a life constrained, managed, and preserved imperfectly. And it is this honesty, accidental or not, that resonates most powerfully. Gold dazzles and art impresses, but the human truth beneath the frailty, the haste, the panic is what endures. Over time, the tomb has influenced how we handle knowledge, mortality, and memory. Archaeology has learned patience from its mistakes. Historians have learned to look for what is hidden and uncomfortable. And the public has learned that even legends contain fragile humanity beneath their shining surfaces. Tutankhamun's tomb doesn't just record a death, it records the reactions of the living ancient and modern to imperfection. Perhaps the most haunting lesson is empathy. Behind the mask and the gold was a boy, a human being, fragile and limited, caught in expectations he could not meet. The whispers preserved in every amulet, every hurried shrine, every hastily inscribed symbol, ask us to consider what it means to live, to die, and to be remembered. The quiet horror of Tutankhamun's tomb is universal. It transcends Egypt, dynasties, and time. It is the horror of imperfection confronted by systems demanding perfection. It is the horror of mortality in a culture obsessed with eternity. No dramatics, no curses, only truth, carefully preserved. And perhaps that is what makes Tutankhamun eternally compelling. Not the gold, not the mask, but the subtle, unrelenting reminder that life is fragile, death is inevitable, and systems, no matter how grand, cannot fully contain what is human. His tomb, sealed for 3,000 years, is a testament to that reality, a quiet record of anxiety and mortality. In the end, it speaks louder than any curse or legend. It tells of a boy, a civilization, and the delicate intersection of life, death, and human expectation. It teaches us that the past is also about vulnerability, compromise, and the quiet horror that accompanies imperfection preserved across millennia. 3,000 years of silence, finally heard. Thank you for watching.